Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Life in the Universe pandemic series. So this is just a series of short talks about things to do with life in the universe that I think are interesting and hope you will as well. And it seems a good time with a raging virus to be thinking about life in the universe and some of the wider questions. And today I want to talk about something that is relevant to our friend coronavirus, which is what is the tree of life? And you might think that's quite an enigmatic question. Perhaps you've not heard of this term, but sometimes you'll hear this term, the tree of life. You hear about life being described as being on a big tree, this tree that describes all living things on the earth and that have ever lived. Even Charles Darwin drew a little tree-like depiction of life on the planet. And you'll see something like this. So this is my very crude, simplified sketch of a tree of life. And we start off down here with the origin of life, and then we split into branches, and that carries on and splits into branches, representing all life on Earth. So what is this? What is this tree of life that people keep talking about and you sometimes see in books? Well, the best way to describe it is actually to speculate and think about when life first started on the Earth. So if you transport yourself back about 4 billion years to the first living thing, you've got this cell, this happy little cell that's sitting there. That's a matter for discussion, but let's just forget that for a moment and imagine a cell. And then for some reason, the populations of this cell get split in two. Maybe there's some geographical event, like an island splits in two. And one population of cells ends up on one island and the other one on the other island. And now they start to go their own separate ways. One microbe may specialize in eating one particular type of food, and on this island they found another type of food, and they're eating something else. They eventually become separate organisms, separate creatures, if you like, that are now heading off on two different evolutionary trajectories. And that would be our split in the tree there, where you've now got two different creatures, both of which have a common ancestor, but they are essentially two different creatures. And fast forward, this process carries on for the next 3.5 billion years with things becoming new species and splitting off right the way through to the present day. So in the present day, for example, you might have a bird in a rainforest that's sitting there, and one population maybe gets separated by some geographical event. Maybe the rainforest gets split in two by some savanna or grassland that forms in the middle, and now one of those birds does something different over here, and the original bird starts evolving differently over here. Or maybe they separate in the same place. One population of birds in the same tree decides to eat nuts, and the other population decides to eat fruit. And so they become two different species, even though they're living in the same place. So there are different mechanisms by which creatures can essentially become separated, either geographically or in the same location, and they split. And in our tree of life, we can think of that as a node or a place where a new branch has formed. So our tree of life has all these splitting branches where in the past, these speciation events, these separations of organisms have occurred and completely new organisms have appeared. And up here maybe is chimpanzees, and maybe here's us, and we had a common ancestor between chimpanzees and human beings that was buried in the history of this tree of life. So all of life on Earth can be described on such a tree. The first interesting thing to note is that we do all live on or have come from one tree of life. You might ask, well, how do we know there's only one tree of life? Why can't there be lots of them? And our genetic apparatus, the genetic information inside all life on Earth is essentially identical. Even the code that translates the genetic information into proteins and molecules is identical across all life, apart from some small modifications here and there. But essentially, our biochemistry is universally pretty much the same. And that tells us that all life on Earth did in fact come from a last universal common ancestor to all life on Earth. This is not a fairy tale. There's good genetic evidence for that. So we all exist on this big tree of life. So you might ask, where does our friend the coronavirus fit on the tree of life? Well, it turns out that viruses are a big problem for this because they don't really fit on the tree of life because they are not cellular life. They have evolved through very different mechanisms. People don't quite understand where many viruses have evolved from. People have different ideas. Some people think that viruses have budded off from cells. Some people think that some large viruses may once have been cells but got smaller. Some people think that viruses are completely separate entities. But they're not like cellular life, where they've evolved from one generation to another through these very well-defined vertical lines of descent, if you like, over many, many generations. They sort of sit at the edges of the biosphere, attacking bacteria or humans, as the case may be, with coronaviruses. And in fact, some people argue about whether they're even alive. And if you're interested in that question, you can see talk number 1 in this series, where I talk about whether viruses are alive. But from the point of view of our tree of life, the point is that they are not cellular life forms. They sort of sit at the edges of the tree, attacking, if you like, various things on the tree of life. So viruses don't fit on our tree of life, but they do interact with it as biological entities, which makes them very interesting things, because they're not conventional like the rest of life on Earth, and it also makes them much more difficult to understand. Now, how do we build this tree of life? As I said, it's not fairy tales, but how do we know this? Well, people have taken a long-term interest in how to build this relationship between all creatures on the Earth. And even Aristotle, who thought about a lot of things, as well as political philosophy, he also did a lot of natural history and wrote books about animals. And he was one of the first people, I think, to consider this idea of resemblances. So if I give you a cat and a lion and a panther, if you look at those creatures, you can probably tell me that they evolved from the same ancestors. They look the same. They've got pointy ears, they've got fur, they've got 4 legs. And Aristotle realized this, and he realized that if you looked at all the creatures on the Earth, you could look at how they resemble each other, and he could start to categorize things. And that's what he did in his book on the natural history of animals. He started to categorize different creatures in different ways, whether they've got blood or not, whether they're warm-blooded or cold-blooded. And this way, he came up with what you might think of as a very early way of characterizing life. This was greatly advanced by Carl Linnaeus, who was an 18th century Swedish botanist and zoologist who did astonishing work in trying to characterize life on Earth. Of course, the good thing about large creatures like cats and dogs is they have very obvious features. When you look at animals, you can tell whether they look similar or not. And Aristotle and later Linnaeus and others were able to build trees of life because of these resemblances of these large creatures. But if you think about microbes, and microbes make up a vast proportion of life on Earth, they're very small, they're relatively simple, they come in a very few types of shapes. They might be round or they might be rod shaped, but not much else. They don't have pointy ears and fur and legs, so they're much more difficult to separate them apart. So putting the microbes on this tree of life turned out to be a more difficult task, and that was resolved by extracting the DNA, the genetic material. And if you take the genetic material out of a living thing, you can read the bases, you can read the information in the genetic code, and you can tell how related that creature is to another creature. So if you take 2 bits of DNA and you line them up, and there are big differences, that suggests that they evolved from each other a long time ago. And if the genetic code is very similar, that might suggest that they're closely related because there hasn't been much time for changes to occur. So in a very simple way, what we can do is extract DNA from different creatures. We can look at the genetic code, we can compare the genetic code and see how similar or different it is to other creatures, and use that to build our tree of life, where the bigger the differences in the genetic code, the further away the creatures are from each other. And that is the modern method of building a tree of life, using different genes to construct this idea of the relationship between creatures. And that's been very successful. That's where our modern trees of life come from. So that's all good. It makes sense. But the problem is it's not quite that simple. And when a scientific theory feels nice and warm and cozy and has a nice natural metaphor like the tree of life, you should always be suspicious that there's probably something a little bit wrong about it. And so it turns out that it is, because the tree of life does not describe completely the way in which life is related to each other. And there are some problems here. And some of the problems are this. First of all, viruses can transfer genetic material from one creature to another, even between different species. And so rather than just genetic information going from one generation to another and changing as it goes through each generation and leading to this nice, simple tree of life where species split and then evolve and then split again, it turns out that genetic information is being transferred across these branches. It's not just a simple tree. And viruses can do this. Viruses that attack bacteria, for instance, will incorporate some of that bacterial information and then transfer it to another bacterium. There are other ways this can happen as well. Microbes can join up together and directly transfer DNA between their cells in a process called conjugation. And conjugation is very important because it's one of the mechanisms by which antibiotic resistance is transferred between microbes in hospitals and other places. Microbes can essentially hand each other their genes and develop very rapid resistance to problems like antibiotics, heavy metals, and other challenges in their environment. So conjugation is enormously important for human beings and for our problems with dealing with antibiotic resistance. There are other ways in which microbes can take up DNA. Some microbes can literally take up naked DNA from the environment. Just imagine what would happen if I told you that you could walk up to a laptop like the one in front of me, touch the screen, and if I do that, touch the screen, I can absorb the DNA that's got stuck on my screen and develop new genetic capabilities, let's say resistance to some viruses or coronavirus. Maybe I could touch my computer, pick up some DNA from someone else and gain instant immunity to a whole range of viruses. That would sound like some science fiction film. But it turns out that bacteria can do this. Some bacteria can take up DNA from their environment, incorporate it into their genetic material, into their genome, and become resistant to different metals, different types of viruses, and other things besides. This is another way in which this DNA can be moved around. So if you're a bacterium on here and you die and your DNA is released into the environment, maybe a bacterium over here can come along and take up your DNA and incorporate it into the genome. And this way, we've got this process called horizontal gene transfer or lateral gene transfer. Horizontal because it's happening horizontally across the tree and not just vertically being handed on from one generation to another. Horizontal gene transfer makes this a little bit too simplified. Rather than being a tree of life, maybe we can think of it as a bush of life, or if you're into Monty Python, a shrubbery of life. I'm sure some of you will get that joke. But the point is, the tree of life turns out to be a little bit too simplified. It's not completely wrong. There are clear genetic relationships between different organisms, and there are organisms that are more ancient than others. And if we pick the right genes, the right DNA, we can build a pretty good tree of life that gives us a good idea of the relationship between different organisms. But we have to be careful because many of these genes, particular types of genes, have been transferred horizontally in the tree. It's not just a vertical tree of life. It's a thrilling idea, the tree of life. Some people think that horizontal gene transfer is so pervasive that we shouldn't really talk about a tree of life at all, and that the whole thing is a complete myth. That's a very strong view. I think probably the consensus today is that you can draw trees of life. If you pick the right genetic material, you can get some good idea of the relationship, and you can draw it in these sorts of diagrams, but you just have to be very careful about the sorts of genes you pick, and you have to be aware of the fact that genes can be transferred. It makes it particularly difficult when you're trying to look at the very base of the tree of life. How did life evolve? What were the earliest organisms that lived on the earth? What were their characteristics? That's very difficult to know because that information has long since been lost in the mists of time. We don't have these creatures around any longer from the base of the tree of life. We have to use microbes that exist today to try and infer what the earliest branches of the trees of life were really like and what the characteristics of those early organisms were like. And this horizontal gene transfer really makes it difficult for people to tell what was going on at the very base of this tree, because the information is not just lost in time, it's also messed up and mixed up with all of this horizontal gene transfer. Nevertheless, the tree of life is a very important concept. It has allowed us to make sense of the vast menagerie of living things on our planet, the relationship between them, and no doubt in the future it will also allow us to better understand the relationship between creatures on the earth and their ancient ancestors, and in fact where they might go in the future. Thanks a lot for joining me. Keep well. Bye.